Welcome everyone to our 13th annual student conference from Kent State Stark. This is a first for all of us. This will be our 2020 virtual conference. And so welcome, we're glad you're here. A few housekeeping details before we get started, and then I will do an introduction and we'll go ahead and get started. I do want to let everybody know that we are recording this. So that we will have these presentations to add to the other presentations. This morning we are doing 5 presentations live, and then you can find all of the other presentations on the Kent Stark website. If you look up virtual conference, you will see that we have a variety of presentations and everything from foreign language to art to a video presentation, poster presentations, etc. So we encourage you to go and take a look at those as well. I think you'll see the breadth of what our students have done. I did want to make just a couple quick thank yous. I wanted to thank our deans for their continued support of the student conference. And I also wanted to make a particular thank you to Julie Spots, because she did all the work on uploading and getting the website. And without that, we would not have had the ability to do this. So I really wanted to make a public thank you to, particularly to Julie Spots. And then the final thank you is simply to all the students who have submitted their work, are willing to present it, and the faculty who have supported them. And so we're very excited to hear what everybody has to do today. On the housekeeping side of things, I'm going to encourage we're going to use the group chat on the side for any questions that you have, and ask everybody to please remember to keep yourselves muted so that it helps with the bandwidth and doesn't take away from that. And so those would be the key housekeeping. I also said to everybody, if you happen to see, and I don't notice it, that somebody else joins, I have to let everybody in, so wave at me if you think I'm not noticing, because I tend to forget to look at that. So, so hopefully this will all work. And so our very first presenter today is Wade Austin Scott. Wade is a senior history major who is planning to graduate in December. So the end is near for Wade. And Wade will be presenting this morning his paper called Our Sense of Place in American Society. And before Wade gets started, I'm going to try our first technical. So bear with me for a second to make sure I can do this. I did try it earlier. So just bear with me while I pull up his. All right, one more second and I should have this. Okay. All right, I assume everybody can see?
Yes.
All right, and this PowerPoint is just going to roll screen behind Wade's presentation. So with that, I'm turning it over to Wade.
Morning, y'all. So like Dr. Hebe said, my focus is on disability history, and so today we will be talking about the 1970s, late 1970s, and the disability rights movement. So when people think of social and civil rights movements and demonstrations in America, they instantly think of the 1960s with events like the African American Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Rights Movement, or the Gay Rights Movement. This includes the demonstrations that occurred during that time period. For example, Bloody Sunday with the African American Civil Rights Movement, the Stonewall Riots of the Gay Rights Movement. Yet one civil rights movement that lacks recognition is the disability rights movement during the 1970s in America. Disabled Americans have lacked a sense of place until the 1970s due to social pressure from mainstream America. Their actions turned disability advocates into political aggressors, trying to find some sense of place in mainstream American societies and communities across America. The fight for implementation of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 helped many find their sense of place in mainstream American societies. Okay, so first, now we're going to talk about Section 504. Many consider the 1973 Rehabilitation Act the first form of protection of civil rights of disabled Americans. However, there was one section in particular that is the most important part. That was Section 504. Section 504A of the Rehabilitation Act states, no otherwise qualified individuals with disabilities, with a disability in the United States as defined in Section 720 shall solely be by reason of her or his disability be excluded from participation in, be denied benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance under any program or activity conducted by an executive agency or by the United States Postal Service. So this statement pretty much protects people from exclusion from anything that has some type of support from the American federal government. This was a major step in the disability rights movement because Section 504A specifically is in the Rehabilitation Act to protect disabled Americans with both visible and invisible disabilities. What we mean by that is visible is obviously you can see. So like cerebral palsy, dystonia, but the invisible ones are the ones you don't see, like PTSD, epilepsy, mental retardation. Those are some examples. Some of the programs could have included having the ability to vote or to go get your mail from said local post office. The ability to receive proper medical treatment at places like hospitals, clinics, or even receiving Social Security disability benefits. The leaders. So we are going to talk here. Now I'm going to say another very important section of 504, which is 504 subsection B. The entry of such state or local government that distributes such assistance and each such department and each other state or local government entity to which the assistance is extended in the case of assistance to a state, local government, a college, university, or other post-secondary institutions, or a public system of higher education, or a local educational agency as defined in Section 8101 of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, systems of vocational education or other school system. These subsections are saying that disabled Americans with both visible and invisible disabilities have a right to some form of post-secondary education, just like mainstream American. Section 504B secured both the college and vocational, which is technical, education rights of disabled Americans, while at the same time giving them a sense of place in the country and mainstream American society. What sense of place is, it's a geographical term that ties an individual or a group of individuals to a certain location. So, for example, you might be born in Ohio, but you feel like your home is in South Florida. Now we are going to talk about some of the stalling tactics that were applied for Section 504. The federal government tried to stall on passage and implementation of Section 504 mainly because of economic purposes. That George Miller realized, who was a representative at the time, this is the right thing to do, but is it economically feasible? And there was also some issues of definitions within society at the time, because handicapped also included alcoholics and drug addicts. But they realized, oh, we need to change that, and quickly did. However, the federal government also was not the only problem. The colleges and universities across the country, like University of Minnesota, refused to pay for it. Because for example, going back to the University of Minnesota, University of Minnesota claimed that it would cost $72.8 billion to renovate everything. And that was, they could not do that. However, going back to my previous statement, they were covered that under law to get federal assistance via Section 504, subsection B. So quickly after they realized drug addicts and alcoholics were included, they quickly changed that, but that still was not enough. Head secretary at the time, Joseph Califano, was not satisfied. Yep. Now we are going to take a look at the biggest and longest takeover of a group of disabled individuals in history. And these photos that you are seeing are documented from this protest. So in spring of 1977, the ACCD, which is the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, which is the Rolling Quads, all these other disability advocacy groups, all rolled in one, wrote a letter to Joseph Califano and President Jimmy Carter advocating for the passage and implementation of Section 504 as is, but they were just ignored, which was not typical, which was not unusual for the time. So the leaders of the 504 demonstration all knew each other beforehand. They all went to Camp Jeanette together, which was a place for both disabled that disabled children with invisible and visible disabilities ran by hippies from the 1960s. This is where they found their sense of place because nobody could judge them, nobody could say anything about them because they were all the same, even though they had all these different disabilities. But once the camp was over, they had graduated and moved on with their lives, they realized that was not the way. That was not how it was in regular mainstream American society. And I use regular very loosely. So they quickly realized they needed to take action. So they wrote, after a series of news reports showing the treatment of disabled children, men, and women in the rehabilitation centers across the country, they quickly realized we need to do this. So the most significant and most impactful demonstration was at the HEW office, which is Health, Welfare, and Education, the San Francisco branch. So the ACCD set up a rally and used flyers, which is one of the photographs you're seeing, to gain support. But by end of day, they weren't being taken seriously. So rushed in and took over the HEW building for 25 days. So most people will wonder how did they survive? Purely by their willingness to sacrifice everything for the future, but also via the Black Panthers. One of the Black Panthers was disabled. His name was Brad Lomax. He called the Black Panthers up and told them what was going on, and they drove clear from Oakland to San Francisco to give them what they needed. They would bring hot meals at night and leave delis and cereals and that for lunch and breakfast. But when asked, one of the protesters asked him, "Why are you helping us?" And the Black Panther member just simply said, quote, "Y'all are just trying to make the world a better place, and that's what we are all about, making the world a better place." So some of the things that they did while they lived in this building were they slept on floors, went on hunger strikes, yet through all this struggle and all these difficult times, it felt like camp all over again. The rallies continued outside and some of the speakers were speakers like Kitty Cone, one of the co-founders of the rally, and Tom Hayden, who was a anti-Vietnam War protester during the 1960s. When the FBI cut off all phone, they used ASL, to American Sign Language, to communicate to the outside. But again, This was people who usually had home assistant aides, home nurses, all willing to risk all that for the future, for rights for future disabled Americans. Um, because now they once they had a meeting, okay, and in the meeting, the Califano never showed up, but George Miller and Representative Phillips did. I cannot remember his first name at the top of my head. And also Eckenberg, who was a representative of Califano, did as well. At one point during the meeting, the hearings, Eckenberg literally ran into a storage closet, locked the door, and hid. George Miller got fed up and literally kicked down the door. Kicked the door off its hinges and pulled him out of there and made him sit down and listen. Now, at this point, if you see all these mainstream Americans realizing, okay, this isn't enough is enough, something needs to change. You know you've done something. Don't know exactly what, but it was not enough. So they flew to DC, about 50 of them, and literally, as soon as they got off the plane, they went to Secretary Joseph Califano's house and sat outside his house protesting. When the cops came to, disperse them, Evan White, this is testimony and a direct quote from Evan White, quote, "The cops showed up, seen a bunch of pissed off people in wheelchairs, and decided we better not fuck with them." Now, that is powerful because they're willing to travel wherever they need to go to get this implemented. So, Evan White was the only one who really kept up with, only reporter that would relay their story, is what I'm trying to say. So after he's gathered all the evidence, he sent it to ABC News, which was having a strike at the moment during that time period, but still was able to air it. And after ABC aired all Evan's documentation, all his reports, the Secretary of Health, Education, Welfare, Joseph Califano, received immense amounts of pressure from every angle: social, political, cultural, you name. So on the 25th day, the Joseph Califano agreed to sign and implement Section 504 as written in the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. This was the first sign of progress. After this, people who were on hunger strikes started eating again. They actually left the HEW building in San Francisco. Now, not all of them did, but most of them did, because some of them wanted to make sure that what Califano said actually happened. But because of this, disabled Americans can now have a right to choose whether they want to go to college or not, and have the same opportunities as mainstream American college students. Now, not saying there will be difficulties, but that's what disability advocacy offices were set up to do, like at Kent State. Now they cannot diagnose somebody, but they can go off a individual's physician's diagnosis to do their see what what their needs needed to be and needed to be met. So, for example, there was a question well, are we going to modify all classes? The answer was no. We don't know yet. It's on a individual case-by-case basis. So, for an example, say somebody is in a wheelchair. They'll need time to be a few minutes late and leave a few minutes early to get to their next class on time. Or if somebody's visually impaired, they might need a tape recorder. But because of Section 504 and the willingness of people to wanting to make changes and find their sense of place and feel like have some sense of normalcy, they were able to do that. Now I will take questions. One sec. Let me pull them up here.
Let me help you with that here, Wade. Let me stop this. Okay, thank you very much, Wade. That appreciate. This is your clap. And so we have a couple questions already. And so the first one, Wade, comes from Dr. Starkey, and she asks, why has the disability rights movement been ignored, do you think, in comparison to some of the other civil rights movements?
Simple, without getting into very complex, it wasn't, it was alive during the 60s and during the 30s, but at that time, in the 30s and 40s, we were in the midst of World War II. So that took precedence over that. Not saying that there wasn't progress made, but still not enough. In the 1960s, late 1960s, disabled Americans were able to get legislation passed, like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 and the ABA of 1968, which is the Architectural Barriers Act. But that still did not protect the actual rights of disabled Americans. And also in the 60s, we had all these different movements, like I stated before, African American Civil Rights Movement, Gay Rights Movement, the Women's Rights Movement, and Vietnam. So we had all these stuff underlying where in the 70s, there wasn't much going on in that sense. Plus, we had President Carter. One of the main reasons he got elected was because most of his voters were disabled Americans that would promise to implement Section 504 if elected.
Okay, so Wade, we have two more questions that we're going to ask you. So one comes from Donovan, and he's says that you mentioned other movements, race relations, for example, being an ongoing discussion, and will continue to be. And he says, should the conversation continue to be held about disabled Americans, is it something that's an ongoing issue?
Yes. I try to stay out of, keep myself out of this as much as possible. But as a disability advocate, as well as a historian, from what I've read, and I know this is going to sound a little crazy, but I truly don't believe with the research I've seen with the ongoing situation right now that the disability rights revolution is quite over yet.
Okay.
For example, there's people who we all know there's people who cheat the system, meaning they'll get hurt at work, but be on temporary disability, but claim disability the rest of their lives. So there is still kinks in the system.
So Dr. Post asks a question. He says, did you find any evidence of other protests elsewhere? And by any chance, did you discover if the Black Panthers helped in any other cases besides the one in San Francisco?
Black Panthers did not help in other cases, and there were other cases in Atlanta, Houston, Denver, Baltimore, and I think it was Atlanta. The Atlanta one and the Houston one really threw me off, but they didn't. Part of the reason why it wasn't as successful as this one, I mean, again, this one lasted 25 days, was because of the advertising and the immense amount of support from outside of their own community.
Okay. And then Tony asks the question, so what issues are people with disabilities fighting for today?
Okay, so some of the issues that are being fought for today is, so for example, somebody I'll use myself as an example because that's the best one I know. A couple of years ago, I've been on full disability since I was 17. A couple of years ago, they took me off because an older doctor, a retired doctor, literally Googled what dystonia was and see that, oh, some can work. And so they took me off. Now, I'm not saying that. Let's just say my neurologist and my specialist team weren't so happy and wrote a very strong letter to the state government. It is also the problem is some of this, it's a states' rights over federal rights, meaning, okay, it might be a federal law, but states have a choice in what to follow. So, for example, Ohio, I'm trying to think how to word this, follows disability rights laws and just disability legislation very well, not very, but looser than other states like, let's say, California, where they are very, very strict.
Okay. Thank you very much, Wade, and thank you everybody for your kind questions. And so that concludes successfully our first presentation. So thank you, Wade, for kicking things off for us.